Hello, welcome to the Noirwich Crime Writing Festival 2020. Noirwich is a partnership between the National Centre for Writing and the University of East Anglia. Thank you to Arts Council England and to this year's festival supporters, Dead Good Books and the Crime Vault. Now this panel is very dear, close to my heart, likewise UEA's, because this is the CW50, which stands for the Creative Writing 50th Anniversary Year panel. I'm joined by Jill Dawson, who was a UEA Creative Writing Fellow around about 2004, I think, Jill, that's correct, isn't it?
I'm a bit vague, but about that time,
yeah. Well, we all sort of forget dates. I'm absolutely useless with them. Jill then went on to be an RLF Fellow, Royal Literary Fund Fellow, and has taught on the BA at UEA and the MA, and is a very good and long-standing friend to the programme. Jill is also the author of 10 novels. Now, let me get this right, because I always sometimes the thing about you crime writers or you writers, you whip out a novel, you know, without me knowing it, or without anyone else knowing it, and suddenly you haven't done 10, you've done 11, you've done 12, but I think it's 10, isn't it, Jill?
It is 10, well done, yes.
Good, but also you've edited a number of collections of short stories and you've written collections of poems as well. Trevor Wood is the author of just one novel, Trevor.
My CV is a lot smaller than Jill's, I think you'll find.
Well, yeah, but it's not about size, Trevor, as we know, is it? It's about quality, of course. So Trevor is a graduate of the MA in Creative Writing Crime Fiction at UEA, and Trevor was on the very first intake, the first year of the course, which began in 2015. So it's an absolute privilege to have Trevor here with his new novel, The Man on the Street, which has been exceptionally well reviewed, and it is my last look on Amazon. It's something at the moment generated, I think, 436 reviews, mostly 4 to 5 star, which is simply exceptional. So this is fantastic to have Trevor here, and also to talk about not just that novel, but being at UEA and that experience. Jill, of course, has most recently written The Language of Birds, which is now out in paperback. Now, to say it's a crime novel would probably be incorrect, but to say it's a novel with crimes in it is absolutely correct, I think. The novel she wrote before that was The Crime Writer, which actually featured Patricia Highsmith in a simply exceptional way, doing things that Highsmith never did in her real life, but perhaps thought very deeply about. Now, I suppose my first question to both of you, I'm not sure who wants to answer initially, is, you know, what is a crime novel? Do you feel you write crime novels? Is it important? What is this genre that we are all so, one way or another, heavily involved with?
I'm happy to go first. I think as you sort of indicated there, crime is at the centre of The Language of Birds, and it's a true crime. It's a real story, the story of the Lord Lucan household and the nanny murdered in 1974, Sandra Rivet. So I can't say it isn't about crime, as are many of my novels. But I think concepts of genre tend to me to be much more of a publishing phenomenon than a writing phenomenon. I don't think that's how we think when we are doing it. I mean, Fred and Edie, you might say, was a true crime novel. That's one of my earlier novels, and yet that's not how I thought of it. It seems to me that the writer just gets very involved with whatever they're doing, and those kind of questions come up later when we wonder where in the bookshop our novels should go. I don't know if that's your experience, Trevor, or if it's much more, I suppose you did the crime writing course, so you had maybe that feeling at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think I set out to write a crime novel without question, and doing the course kind of made that obvious, really, I think. But I think you're right. I'm talking to other writers, particularly this year. I've got to know a lot of the debut writers that I might not have got to know because they're in other genres. But they've written novels that you could easily classify as crime novels. They've certainly got crimes in them, but they're being marketed as something completely different. So I think it's mainly the publishers who are concerned about what genre your book fits in so that they know where to place it. But aside from that, most writers aren't that interested, I don't think, about what genre they're writing in.
Well, Highsmith, one of my novels, as Henry mentioned, is about Patricia Highsmith. She was very concerned not to be considered a crime writer. She actually hated the term, and so I rather playfully and naughtily called the novel The Crime Writer. But I think possibly what she was identifying was how much the genre has changed and how much the status of the genre has changed. And possibly she's responding to something which was very much more evident when she was writing, which was a sort of pejorative sort of term or feeling, and she wanted to be taken seriously. I don't think any of us need to worry about that anymore. I do think it's a genre that's being taken seriously and breaking boundaries, and I don't know, it's not something that concerns me, although interestingly I was in a bookshop at the weekend in the Lakes, one I hadn't visited before, and he went to get my books for me to sign, and it was interesting that The Crime Writer was in the crime category section and The Language of Birds wasn't. I found that interesting, but I did simply think, as we've just said, oh well, that's for selling the book, which is a different thing from writing the book. It perhaps is important then for readers.
Yeah, I don't think that snobbery exists anymore. I think it did used to, but I think people have come to realise that there's some awfully good writers who are writing what happen to be crime novels at the moment. I think we saw with the Booker Prize last year, I think, wasn't it, when Belinda Bauer was shortlisted, that people are starting to realise that there are some very good writers producing crime novels.
Well, and also I wonder if, there's lots of misconceptions. Highsmith herself never wrote a detective novel, if you like, where everything was sort of found out and sewn up at the end. And I would say none of my novels which concern themselves with crime. Lucky Bunny is about a criminal woman, from start to finish. It's absolutely about crime. But she doesn't go to prison. It's not a spoiler to say, a bit like Highsmith, I quite like my criminals to get away with it. And I wonder if the misconception from the past is that it should all be sewn up, and that's what people are expecting, and perhaps disappointed if that doesn't happen. I would certainly say if that's the case, then I don't kind of probably play by those rules, but so do many of the people I'm reading and enjoying. And so I think that might be a rather old-fashioned misconception that Highsmith definitely had. It was definitely what she didn't want to write, because of course she loved her Tom Ripley, who was the original sort of hero criminal, really.
Interestingly, the Crime Writer, Jill, is set in 1964 when Highsmith was in Suffolk, and she was in theory, or trying to write plotting and writing suspense fiction, her, if you like, how-to book. Trevor, of course, being a graduate of the MA in creative writing, crime fiction at UEA, knows that work inside out, don't you, Trevor? So now I'll put you on the spot, Trevor. So some of the key takeaways from that book, particularly, I don't know whether you remember it. I don't really mean to put you on the spot, but in relation to Highsmith, and one of her books, The Talented Mr. Ripley, was on the critical reading list. And the thing that struck me, I don't know about you, Trevor, is the fact that Highsmith's real aim was suspense, of course, how you generate suspense. But she also likes slow beginnings. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Trevor.
I don't think there's any problem with slow beginnings. I was looking back earlier, doing my research at the essay that you forced me to write about where I got the ideas for my book, and I'd actually quoted quite a bit from The Talented Mr. Ripley, mostly about the voice, actually. I like the way she used kind of close third person for Ripley, which I've kind of used in my book. We read a lot of her stuff while I was there, and I'm constantly quoting. When you go on panels a lot, people are always asking you what the perfect crime would be. And I think Strangers on a Train is pretty much the perfect crime, getting somebody else to commit your crime for you. And obviously that was Highsmith as well. So, I mean, if she wasn't a crime writer, she was very good at writing crime stories, I think I'd have to say.
I do know also that book very well, Plotting and Writing Suspense Fiction, which she wrote in 1 month whilst living in Suffolk, in the house that my novel is set in. So I got very intrigued by the fact she was rewriting The Glass Cell. She was writing the novel The Suspension of Mercy, which is her only novel set in England. And she was writing the sort of how-to book. And it seems to me that rather than a how-to book, it's a how-I book. You know, it's very much how she did it, very idiosyncratic. She admits things like she sets off plotting and then she sort of grinds to a halt. And I'm sure many of us understand and recognise that moment where we knew this much, but we don't know what's happening now. And there's a sort of foggy 2/3 really that you haven't actually written. And she talks about wanting to be surprised in her own work and not wanting to bore herself by knowing where it's going. And actually that's often been my experience of writing. I have a premise, I might have a real story I'm basing it on, but I do want to be surprised. I don't need to know everything. And I don't mean some sort of, you know, rather woo-woo sort of idea that the novel is taking me over. It's not really that. It's that there has to be times, I think, where we start imagining our characters doing things we didn't imagine them doing originally, or behaving differently because we know them better than we did at the start. So although she might like slow beginnings, she also says she doesn't like a beginning that's passive, descriptive, like, you know, the moon glimmered on the lake. A man, and it's usually a man in Highsmith, should always be standing there, you know, leaving the station or leaving his room or walking with a gun. She likes action in the first line. And my very, very first novel, which I did after doing an MA, like you, Trevor, although mine was long, long ago, and it was in Sheffield. My first line of my first novel is, I take an axe to mix head. Now, if that isn't a crime novel, also, I don't know what is, but it was never taken as one. It's a novel about a woman trying to leave a violent relationship that she's unable to admit is violent, and she fantasizes all the time about murdering her partner, which, you know, that was, I suppose, quite a quiet literary novel that had the usual modest reception. But I think I rather like Highsmith's idea that the first line should contain an action and have somehow absorbed that.
I'm just looking at the first lines of your last two novels, you two, just to see where we're at with that. So Trevor's, Jimmy didn't have a watch, and yours, Jill, the first time I heard the voice I was 6.
Yeah, pretty plain.
Okay, no, it's interesting. They're both one way or another related to time. Actually, in both the novels are what I'd call historical or near historical. Trevor's set in 2012 and in Newcastle around the Queen's visit to the city and the, what was it, the Silver Jubilee. Yeah, exactly. And yours, Jill, set in the 1970s, but centering around, as we've mentioned, the real life case of Lord Lucan and how he murdered the nanny. Now, this brings me to what you've just mentioned in relation to surprise. You know, both of you have your novels grounded in a real place, in a real time. You know, and particularly in relation to yours, Jill, your novel, The Language of Birds, and The Crime Writer, one way or another, are centred around real characters and real facts. And indeed, even in The Language of Birds, we have some transcripts from the coroner's court, I believe. You know, this is factual. How do you generate the surprise?
the problem I always have is the reader knows the ending. I mean, if you want to know what happened to Sandra Rivet, you just need to look it up. She was murdered. So I absolutely cannot surprise them with the ending. And that's been true for quite a few of my novels. In Fred and Edie, she's hanged, and you look at the back and you know she's hanged. So you have to read the whole novel with that knowledge. Now, I quite like that constraint. I like what that imposes creatively. It's as if I have to find another narrative or another way to create suspense. And I suppose I also work with the idea that the reader knows the story, or thinks they do. They think they know about Lucan, and they might know all the ways in which he escaped, or was he ever found, or did he live in Australia, or, you know, has he popped up again? They might know that, but then surprise themselves by realizing they know very little about his victim. So where I'm using an element of surprise is, oh, here's something you didn't know. And the facts that I do put in, even though I change, I mean, my character's called Mandy. She isn't a Sandra Rivet. She's from a different part of the world. She's a different age. Many things about her are different, but the two facts which struck me as particularly poignant in that case was that Sandra Rivet did have 2 children of her own that she'd given up for adoption, because it's the 1970s, it wasn't okay to be an unmarried mum. And also she had spent a brief period in a psychiatric unit. So those are my two starting points, and that's where I get my narrative. And I wanted to say to the reader, doesn't this create some poignancy? You know, here's a woman looking after someone else's children, aristocratic people's children, and had to give her own up. You know, one was looked after actually by her own family, but another child was given up for adoption. And also questions of who's mad and who's insane and who ends up in psychiatric units. Not Lord Lucan, but actually his wife and the nanny both spent a spell in one. That, to me, seems interesting as to what society thinks about, you know, violence, men's behaviour versus women's behaviour. It's fascinating. So all of my interest, if you like, is in the factual stuff. I can't deny that. I don't even think I am a regular novelist. I don't want to make things up. That has never been particularly my impulse, just imposing my own version. I've always had an investigative interest. And I think I probably would be a biographer, because I love that form, except that I'm maybe too lazy to spend 7 years on it, or however long they seem to take. You know, a novel comes along a bit quicker. I do really feel that more and more, that seems to be where my compulsion lies. I don't know, Trevor, if you like the research in writing, or do you find it distracting, or do you enjoy it?
I like it to a certain extent, Jill, I'd have to say. I don't want to spend 6 months doing it, but I like to get the details right. So yeah, I do a fair bit. I mean, my main character is a homeless veteran, and I was in the Navy for 16 years, so I didn't really need to do a lot about the veteran side, but I started volunteering at a local soup kitchen to try and get to know a few homeless people, and to get to know how the kind of system worked, if you like, and what was available for them. So I'm prepared to do a fair bit to get things right. But yeah, I wouldn't want to go and you know, travel to Brazil for 3 months and study the local fauna or something. That wouldn't really be my cup of tea, I think.
No, but I approve of your kind, what you've just said, actually going and it's sort of like the method acting way of research. I've often said to my students, don't spend too long in archives or on the internet. That's not how you get your research. I actually mean going there quite often. I mean, I did stalk that house that Highsmith lived in Suffolk and just walk the village endlessly, thinking about, wow, how must that have been in the 1960s if you were an American woman, quite an open lesbian, living alone, smoking, drinking. You know, I was fascinated. So I do approve. I think too much time on the internet isn't the way to get a vivid story.
Because you just had to walk out of your front door, Trevor, didn't you? Because you live in Newcastle. Your novel is set in Newcastle. Yeah,
to a certain extent. I guess I'm lazy in that sense, but I've although you can tell I'm not a Geordie, I've lived here for nearly 30 years now, and I know the city pretty well. But I did walk out of my door and took a camera with me, and I took photos of all the places I was planning to use in the novel. and you see things that you wouldn't normally see. So I hope I've found bits of the city that people really hadn't paid a lot of attention to before. And I found out, interestingly, during lockdown, right at the start, when we were allowed to go on these little short walks, we started, my wife and I started heading off just, down random little streets and things. And I found all kinds of places that are now going to be in my new book that I didn't know existed at all. So although I know the city pretty well, I think there's still a lot to learn about it.
And Trevor, in relation to your protagonist, Jimmy Mullen, the homeless vet who's suffering from PTSD, it's a remarkable portrayal of someone on the edge, someone who's really had some terrible experiences in their lives, and how, but nevertheless still manages to be very humane, who manages actually in the end to be pretty intrepid and tough and sort things out. What sort of journey was that like to go on with him? I mean, was that your idea from the beginning?
Well, kind of. That was what I kind of hoped to do. I wanted to start with somebody who it was going to be hard for people to empathise with, and make them empathise with him, really. And kind of, we were talking about surprise, and some of the surprise I was kind of introducing was some of the terrible things that he's done in the past that you gradually find out about. But sometimes once you've got to kind of like him, and I wanted to kind of challenge readers to kind of show that this is a very grey area. Anybody can become homeless. So this guy was once a very organised, competent guy, but he made some bad decisions. There was some bad luck, and I wanted to kind of show that, so that possibly when people actually meet people who are homeless in reality, they might start thinking again about how they got there. And I hope I've achieved that.
It's certainly, I would say that because we began this journey with you one way or another, Trevor. But don't hear it from me. I think on the you have this incredible quote from Lee Child, don't you? Which describes the novel: fresh, original, authentic, and salty, should be an instant classic.
Yeah, I was rather pleased when that came through, Henry, I have to admit. And Lee, of course, you probably remember, was our first visiting writer on the Crime MA. The very first weekend, Jill, you won't know this probably, it was 3 residentials a year for the Crime MA. And we started in the September of 2015, and on the second day in the classroom, we had Lee Child for 3 hours to talk to. So
fabulous.
So to then, a couple of years later, get a quote from him on the book was fantastic.
It's funny how you remember the visiting writers, don't you? The year I did my MA, we had James Kelman, and
Wow.
He actually won the Booker that year, and he was so fantastic. I don't know if you've ever heard him speak. I mean, there'd been a lot of complaint, there wouldn't be now, I mean, this was a long time ago, about how much swearing there was in his novel. How late I am, how late. And someone had counted out how many expletives were on the first page. And Kelman was absolutely raging about his right to use his own vernacular. And I loved it. And we also had Pat Barker, who told us how to structure. She'd structured the trilogy that won the Booker, and she told us not just how she structured the first novel, but how all 3 fitted together. And I think the excitement of seeing a practitioner talk you through how they did something is, absolutely thrilling for writers, isn't it? When we're struggling with, how do I even finish this first novel? So those are the 2 that stayed in my mind. And Barry Hines, in fact. Do you remember him, who wrote Cares, which was a classic?
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of things about class and vernacular voices that's been very important to me in my writing and my thinking about writing. So I sometimes think that stuff might seem like an accident, but it's very fortuitous because it does often shape us.
I think
You've had huge amount of experience teaching all around the world, and Trevor, you've been to numerous festivals, you've listened to a lot of writers. There is no one way, though, is there? Surely that at some point one listens to too many sort of different perspectives or points of view in relation to how to progress. What would you say to that?
I think, well, you obviously have to find your own way. There are so many different ways of doing it. I mean, I was really interested to hear Jill talking about Highsmith not really being much of a planner, that she kind of started and then went, which is exactly what I do.
I remember it, Trevor.
I just like the organic nature of it. I think it does help if you're surprising yourself. I think that will transfer to the readers as well. I think genuinely, if you don't know what's going to happen next, it's very hard for the readers to know what's going to happen next. And I hope that comes over. But we had a mixture of people coming to talk to us, and some of them were very determined planners, writing huge plans before they even started. I mean, yeah. I start with a basic premise and some characters, and off I go. And I think with The Man on the Street, I always knew what the ending was, but only in a kind of loose sense. I didn't know who'd committed the crime. I didn't even really know what the crime was. That all came to me as I was writing. But when you talk to other people, I mean, Lee Child does much the same. I remember, as a guide, if you want one, he was probably good for me to be the first speaker, because he came in and he said he sits down in September, I think it is, isn't it? And starts on page 1 and off he goes and he finishes the book in 3 to 4 months, I think I'm right to say.
Bit longer, but yeah.
Okay. And so I kind of thought, oh, well, that's kind of what I want to do as well, so I'm going to try it. But we had other people, who do plan. And some of the people on the course couldn't believe that I didn't sit down and write out huge plans, because they did. But
I think what's gratifying, having reread The Man on the Street, Trevor, is that actually it hasn't changed that much, has it, from the work you're submitting?
I'd say it's probably about 75% what was there at the end of the MA. I mean, I changed the structure around early on, primarily because I'd started originally with a scene in the Falklands War, where Jimmy first kind of, it would have been chronologically the starting point of the story, really. But I realised I didn't want people to pick it up in a shop and read a war scene in the first chapter, because it would have given them the wrong idea about what the book was going to be. So I moved that back a bit. And then probably in the last 2/3, there was quite a lot of changes during the editing process. But with an editor who didn't actually take the book on eventually.
Maybe what we're looking for, and it sounds like you got it and we're lucky with Lee Charles, is sort of endorsement or a mirror for this is how I'm doing it. Is that okay? Because I think a lot of writers have this strange idea that whatever they're doing is wrong, that everybody else plans, for instance. I mean, I absolutely now know many people who don't like me, so I feel reassured by that. I do just set off. I allow a lot longer than Lee Childs, more like 3 years, two to write it, 1 to faff about. But even so, it seems to me that that's what writers want. They want to be they want someone to confirm that what they're doing will work. And so if you are a meticulous planner, and I also know some published writer friends, I won't know names, but who really are, then that can work as well. It's just sort of not feeling that there is a right or wrong way seems to be a big part of the sort of teaching and being taught process. I used to always read those Paris Review interviews with everybody. There's a big series of them, and you could just flick the page. You could hear one writer saying absolutely categorically, you must do it like this, you must write every single day, and you turn the page and someone else you admire equally says, I often go 6 months without writing. So then you feel great, okay, I can find myself in this. And I even remember reading one, and I can't remember who it was now, who said that just like me, they always allow themselves a year off. So I thought, great, that's what I need for my brain to sort of empty out and then fill up again. A bit like Homer Simpson. There's a cartoon moment where he says exactly that. And I thought, yes, I've always thought that. So that's what I feel we're looking for. Some way to feel reassured that what we're doing will produce a novel that we can be proud of. It seems to me there's, and that's the tutor's role, I think, as well, actually, is to allow people to find that. I don't know, Henry, you're teaching, so...
Well, do you have a structure in mind at the beginning, Jill?
No, I mean, if you saw the mess, which is my work in progress, I am just The only thing I have now is the confidence that I've done it this way and it's been okay. There's always a moment where the whole thing gets jettisoned, or I discard 30,000 words, or decide it has to be in this voice, not that one. With the Highsmith novel, I kept feeling as if I was writing two novels, the one she was fantasizing about, the one that was really happening. And I kept worrying about how they might dovetail. And in the end, they didn't, and I didn't care. You know, it's just a sort of a lot of trial and error. It's a very, I think it's probably, you know, quite a wasteful way of working. Maybe if I did plan for a year, I wouldn't have to do this. But it does work for me, and I'm confident that I'm really not afraid to discard work, start afresh, change everything. So I think if you're willing, the experience I had when I taught at UEA, and I remember it vividly because a couple of my students, probably more than I know in fact, but two in particular, you know, have gone on to be published authors, quite well known. And I remember saying in the very first class sort of how much rewriting I did and how big the change. I might reconceive it and think, oh, I'll tell the whole thing from this person's point of view, you know. And you saw at once some people retreat, like, oh my God, I'm not doing that kind of work, I'm just going to fiddle around. And other people understanding, that might be what it takes to get the novel the way I want it. So that's always been my sort of approach, is, yeah, it's a lot of work really if you want to really enter into it. It's not fiddling around the edges, editing, you know, it's a much bigger process, it seems to me.
How do you know, Jill, when you have the right voice? Because, you know, because your work is so intriguing, the way you for a number of novels now, you've used real figures. And then if we take The Language of Birds, you also have two characters, both nannies, one in the first person, Rosemary, and the other in the third person, Mandy. You know, how did you feel that you got those voices, and at what point did you feel happy with those?
Yeah, I mean, I love voice. I love it when I read, as well as wanting it in my own work. So it is the thing I work most on. And I think all that happens is, I mean, it's interesting, in The Language of Birds, one of the characters hears voices. You know, she has psychotic moments and she might be schizophrenic or she might be psychic, depending you know what you think. And actually I think that what I try and do is read something until I can hear a voice in my head that I want to replicate. So when I was reading Highsmith, you read 22 of her novels, as I did, hundreds of short stories, her notes, and you begin to hear her, and then you sort of have a go at ventriloquizing, really. And that's actually for me a great pleasure. I don't mind if other people's work doesn't contain that. I understand it's not everyone's joy in writing, but to me there's something very interesting in the idea of sort of hearing a voice and then trying to express it. So I also wanted, in The Language of Birds, Rosemary and Mandy to be different, to suggest that they're two Fen girls, but they're actually very different. Rosemary's much more naive in a way, and she's very positive towards this Lord Morven character, the sort of glamorous aristocratic man. And Mandy's much more savvy, and my point there is neither of those positions will protect you. Their girls are not to blame for their own death or for the fate that befalls them. Actually, women endlessly are blamed for the ways in which, oh, she must have known, or, you know, why didn't she leave him? And I wanted, you know, I've written about this a lot, I've experienced domestic violence, so it's very much a theme of mine. I wanted to look at the idea, what if you just fall in love with someone and you absolutely don't know? So Rosemary is a little in love with this glamorous character, and she can't really see his evident violence for what it is. So I needed the two voices, I suppose, and one girl who, she's just simply not as intelligent either, I have to say, in her case, as Mandy. But intelligence doesn't protect you either. Sadly, in this case, I do very much want to suggest that the only thing that would have protected the women involved would have been if they'd listened to the accounts of his wife, who had already, I mean, he'd snatched the children, etc., etc. She had already pointed out some of his violent tendencies. But that was ignored. That's often the case.
Trevor, in relation to your protagonist Jimmy, you know, he is aware of his past, isn't he? And we have flashbacks that are violent, that are disturbing. You know, where would you say he is now? At what point in that novel did he really come to terms with who he was, who he is?
Very, very late on, really, Henry, I think. And I kind of wanted that to be deliberate. I mean, he's one of the tragedies of PTSD, I think, with servicemen is that they're the least equipped to be able to deal with it. They're trained not to show weakness and not to admit any problems. And also, if they do have problems, to solve them themselves without getting any help. And I wanted to convey that fairly strongly. And he kind of needed the catalyst of somebody else to come along and push him into accepting that he needed to get some help. Which is why I wanted the kind of person who kind of comes to his aid and drives him into kind of accepting who he is a kind of feisty young woman who doesn't take any prisoners and really drives him on despite his reluctance to get involved in any kind of police business. It's a woman whose father has gone missing and he thinks he might know what's happened to him, but he doesn't want to get involved. And so this woman comes along and drags him basically into the real world again. And I needed him to have that catalyst to get him started because he's been stuck in the same place for a long time.
As I understand it, he's going to return. Is that correct?
He is, yeah. To my surprise, Henry, as you'll no doubt remember, I was pretty certain I was writing a standalone novel about a homeless man who sees a murder, but no one believes him. And pretty much every publisher who was interested was equally convinced that it was a series. So it's now, at the moment, it's going to be a trilogy, and we'll see where it goes from there, I think. So yeah, book 2 is already written and is out in ebook quite soon in October.
Wow.
Is he still homeless in the book 2?
Plot spoiler, Jill.
Oh, okay. Don't then. No, don't, because I hate them.
It depends. It depends how you count homeless. I mean,
Right.
The homeless stats include all kinds of people who live in hostels, people who sofa surf. So he's moved on a bit in book 2. I'll say that much.
Okay. I was only thinking what a brilliant device, because people so invisibilize the homeless, don't they? They don't.
Yeah.
You're not even aware they might be there as a witness. You're like something people don't see. So it is a brilliant device for him seeing more. And also, you can absolutely imagine that reluctance to seek out the authorities or tell the police. Yeah. So yes, I can absolutely see legs in it. I'm glad you're doing another one.
That's I mean, that's what I liked about the character when I first started to think about it. That I loved playing with that invisibility. That people aren't aware he's there, so he can witness all kinds of things. And people think there's nobody in the street, but it's a homeless guy, so they don't count him. And I wanted to play with that a bit.
Jill, what are you working on now?
Well, during lockdown, I had signed a book deal, so I had a commission, which always helps, i.e. I've got a deadline. And I just got on with a novel I've long wanted to write, but had thought needed a long stretch, so that's what we've had. But as for saying what it's about, I'm not sure I want to. It's a historic one. It does have a murder in it. It's long ago, and it's local to me. I live in the Cambridgeshire Fens, not that far from Norwich, about an hour and a bit from Norwich. And it's very much set in this landscape, but long ago, further back than I've ever gone. So I've been doing tons of thinking about what the Fens, which was actually very much reclaimed land, it was underwater, what it would have been like. So that's probably as much as I should say, because I've got this superstitious feeling that when you're working on something, if you talk about it, you just use up all the desire to get on with it. That has to go into the work. If you start telling people about it, it's almost done. I've written it. So I'm trying not to, basically. But it will come out, I hope. It's Sceptre again, my publisher for all my novels, 10 novels. So I'm very pleased to remain with Sceptre in 2022. That's how far off. Yeah.
Wow. So Jill, working on your 11th novel,
Mm-hmm.
how does it feel in relation to I guess, engagement, to fulfillment, to your original ambition? Are you where you want to be?
That's
Are you
an
still infused?
interesting one. Still confused.
Infused.
You will know, Henry, that when you go back to the beginning, and I don't know if you're finding this, Trevor, but you feel as much of a rookie as you ever were. I mean, every novel has its own challenges. I don't think, oh, great, I've done this before. The only part of me that thinks that is the part that can reassure me through the emotions that writing a novel is all about. You know, so the days when I don't want to do it, I know I've been there before. The days when I feel it's terrible, I've been there before. I can kind of keep myself sustained emotionally. Creatively, I keep setting myself bigger challenges. And you heard then that this is a time period I've never written about and don't know anything about. So I guess the challenge here is, can I pull that particular world and era? Can I make something convincing? Where I want to be is an interesting one. I have got a big project in mind, and it's sort of over the horizon. And I wonder why I haven't knuckled down to do that one. So this novel is one more novel and then maybe that. So we shall see. I've always got more novels than I'll probably live to write. It's feeling, you know what I mean? I've got hundreds. They're always pressing at me. It's almost like, not this one.
The ideas are still coming.
In a problematic way. I wish they wouldn't, actually, because I do feel time running out and thinking, blimey, when I'm going to write that one. But interestingly, the one I'm doing now, at the point when I started work on the Lucan novel, I'd gone to King's Lynn to look into a particular story and thought I would write about it. And instead, that day, I started thinking for some reason about the Lord Lucan case and ended up writing that novel. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. And I now realise the one I'm writing now is from that time, if that makes sense. So the sense in which novels are backing up, begging you to write them. If I ever ran out of that feeling, then I can't quite imagine it. Yes, then I'd probably stop. But I have a sense there's almost too many clamouring at me. I don't know if other writers feel that or if that's particular. What do you think, Trevor?
I wish, still, I wish.
Really? Ooh,
Yeah.
I'm a bit.
Second novel under your belt. How does it feel, Trevor?
Well, it feels amazing, Henry. Obviously, I've started this much later than most people do, so I'm not sure I'll ever get as many as Jill's managed to get out there, no matter how hard I try. But yeah, when we started your course, all of us just wanted to get published in one way or another, and many of us have. It was a fantastic course, and there's a lot of us out there now, which is brilliant. But I think we're talking about a second 2-book deal. So that will mean 4, which is way beyond my wildest imaginings,
Right.
3 or 4 years ago. The third one will certainly be the third of the trilogy, the Jimmy trilogy. But I think I want to stop there because I didn't want it to become like Midsummer. I don't want my homeless guy tripping over bodies left, right and centre in the city because it becomes a bit absurd. And I kind of want to keep it real. So I could just about see my way to 3 books. So the 4th book will be something new, I think. And as of this moment, I haven't really got the faintest idea what that will be. But I've got a bit of time now because the 3rd book's not going to be due until middle of next year. So I've got a bit of time to think about what the next one will be. But I'm absolutely stunned and grateful that I'm getting the chance to keep writing.
So if you don't mind, if we could just bring us back to UEA and the anniversary of the creative writing program, which began in 1970, 50 years ago.
Wow.
Jill, what are your lasting impressions of your time as a fellow at UEA and indeed as a tutor?
Oh, I have a lovely, lovely feeling. I mean, I just left London, moved to this part of the world, and then got my fellowship at UEA. And I was actually pregnant with my son. And it was the year that Lorna Sage's Bad Blood came out. And I remember I'd had the baby by then, and he was in the nursery at UEA. And I'd gone to one of her events and I could hear her talking, and I loved that book. But because the baby was crying, I didn't want to go in and disturb her. So I waited outside. And in fact, she sadly died that year. And so I never got the chance again to see Lorna Sage. And I think my lasting feeling, interestingly, just as a little aside, that son, now 20, because we're talking 20 years ago, is at UEA doing English now.
Oh.
He's in his second year. Fabulous. He loves it too. He stayed at the Ziggurats. He loves everything about it. But my lasting feeling actually was quite a magical place, full of that sense. I mean, Vic Sage was very kind to me. He introduced me to his PhD students. He had a real influence on the novel I was writing at the time, which was Wild Boy. Just really quite a special feeling for me is how it remains. You know what I mean? Just much more so than my own degree, and even perhaps my own masters, actually, which were, you know, Nottingham and Sheffield respectively. For me, the UEA has a special place in my heart, really.
Trevor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be doing any of this if I hadn't done the UEA course. I'd already written a comic crime novel, which I'd kind of put out there, but nobody had really shown much interest in it. When I saw the course announced, it was the perfect time for me. Everything about it was great. Yourself and Tom and Laura were amazingly supportive and encouraging. My classmates, I'm still in touch with every single one of them now, and we still swap work. So the peer-to-peer model has carried on without you, I'm afraid, but we're still, several of us are still, we're still swapping our work around and critiquing each other's work. And without that, the man on the street wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. So, yeah, it was fantastic for me. And I also got to know Norwich. I'd been there, I think, once before and didn't know it that well. But I grew to really love it. It reminds me a lot of Newcastle in size, actually. It's a very easy city to kind of navigate your way around. It doesn't take long to go from one side to the other. And I like my cities compact and small. It's also a good size for a crime novel, a small city, nobody can hide.
What are your tips for, so Jill, you know, your long experience as a creative writing tutor, you know, what are your top tips to, well, should we call them crime writers, should we call them suspense writers, or fiction writers? And then on to you, Trevor.
Okay.
Well, I like a quote, I think it's Mark Billingham, about suspense, where he mentioned that in order to have suspense in a novel, you have to care about somebody. You don't have to like them, but you have to care. And when I think, just going back to a early conversation about Ripley, I, like everyone else, did find myself wanting him to triumph, and I think that's very interesting. So the idea of a novel where you have to turn the page because you really simply want to know what happens, I think it's very old-fashioned of me to say that, but I still think that one matters, and that would be, in a way, often what I'm craving. Beautiful prose helps immensely, and I do care about that too, and I will read a novel that doesn't have, you know, sort of the strongest plot if the prose is very pleasing, but best of all is a combination of the two.
Trevor?
Well, very similar. I think character all day long for me. Create the character and then let people worry about him. And they will. If you get the character right, people will follow him. They'll follow him into some fairly dark places, but they'll follow him. So yeah, firstly, I'd say find that character. Find the character that people will follow. And the other bit I've always liked, and it's a screenwriter rather than a crime writer, but I've always liked William Goldman's advice to enter late and leave early. So I tend to come into almost every chapter with something already happening and get out as soon as it's done its job. So keep the pace moving that way.
So would either of you recommend Highsmith's plotting and writing suspense fiction for would-be writers?
I loved it for what it reveals about her and her methodology. So I'd recommend it for that if you're interested in Highsmith. I don't think she's suggesting universal rules that apply to everyone, not at all.
Yeah,
It's an odd book, isn't it?
I don't think there are any universal rules.
No.
So there's nothing specific I'd say you have to read this, but if there was anything, I'd say Stephen King's On Writing for a crime writer probably is pretty useful. But, don't believe everything he says.
And I haven't read that. And my students often mention that one. So I have a good feeling towards it. But I must admit, I haven't read it. My favourite quote, I was thinking about this today, is Beryl Bainbridge, a writer I really love, who says, well, when asked why her novels were so short, said, "Oh, yes, if I had more time, they'd be shorter still." And that's something I agree with and that I struggle over. Trying to pare it down, I like to do.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jill Dawson. Thank you very much, Trevor Woods. And thank you very much for listening and watching, everyone. So please go out and buy The Language of Birds by Jill Dawson, and go out and buy and read, if you haven't already, The Man on the Street by Trevor Wood. Can you see that carefully? There we go. Beautiful books, beautifully crafted, beautifully plotted, full of suspense and characterization. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Henry.
Henry.